Hi, I'm Sean Devlin. I'm the curator of the archaeological collections here at Mount Vernon, and one of the members of our archaeology department. We're going to have a chance today to look at a reconstructed cabin that's a replica of something that would have appeared most likely on one of those quarter farms, and most likely would have dated to the later period of 18th century when Washington had switched to wheat. What I would like to do right now is maybe use this opportunity, since we are standing inside of a reconstruction, to begin to actually apply an archaeologist's eye, an eye towards the material elements that are here in the landscape, and think about how we might actually be able to, what evidence they might leave for archaeologists to discover after 200 years has passed and we don't have the visible evidence above the ground to sort of deal with on a daily basis. So if we look actually towards the cabin here, we can see that this type of structure that was implemented leaves very little physical trace under the ground in terms of its foundations or an actual physical footprint that we can then come in and discover. Cabins like this were constructed to, quite frankly, be mobile if they needed to be. They could be picked up and moved. You might see 6 or 7 cabins arrayed together around an overseer's cabin. That's actually a system that Washington implemented in the decades of the 1780s and 1790s. And he actually instructed at places like Union Farm that existing cabins be picked up and moved to a centralized location where they could be gathered and set up in that new system. Now, that mobile nature of the cabin can be seen in the fact that it's basically laid on a wooden sill directly onto the ground surface. There is no brick that's sort of underpinning structures like this generally. And much more often, it is simply timbers laid directly on the ground surface. We can think about this as almost like a log cabin type of setup. And if you look at the walls here, what you can see is actually the timbers that construct the walls, and the sort of tan material in between those logs is actually something that we refer to as chinking. It's a clay material that's packed between those timbers to form the walls themselves. So what that means for us is a cabin like this archaeologically might not have telltale brick outlines, but we might find elements of chinking in the ground, in the layers of soil that are just underneath the ground surface. We might find nails that bind some of the corners and other portions of the timber frame structure together. Particularly important actually is the chimney. Here you can see the way that this chimney actually leans away from the cabin itself. And in part, one supposition is that's designed in a fashion so that if this timber and clay chimney were to catch fire, because it is not a brick chimney, that the chimney could actually be pushed away from the rest of the cabin if it ignited. And thus you would be able to save the rest of the cabin while the chimney sort of fell to the ground and burned. So that's some of the evidence that we might find architecturally for structures like this. But the space that is outside of that interior location is also of central importance for the daily lives of the individuals who would have been living here. So where I'm standing now would most likely be a work yard, places where food preparation might take place, things like sewing, other chores. You might see children playing in this space, all sorts of activities that we think about in terms of what are the things that people need to do to survive and to run a household in a daily sense. We're taking place right outside the doorway here. Now, archaeologically, what's most interesting about that possibility is, despite all those things that I just documented or said might be happening in this location, is that one of the best ways we've found for locating yard spaces is that there's very few artifacts in them. And in part, that's because those spaces, if you think about it, they are sort of the living rooms of their era, right? And people actually wanted to clear out that space so it wasn't cluttered, so that they could get lots of different things done. A final thing that I'll point out in this location is, while it may not necessarily have traditionally been this close to a cabin, one of the central components of provisioning or food supplying enslaved African Americans on plantations, particularly in Virginia in the 18th century, was the notion of these provision gardens. Washington experimented quite frequently with fertilizer and with green manures and other kinds of manures to add to the fertility of the landscape here at Mount Vernon. Some of the folks who are practicing that on a most immediate basis are the enslaved individuals and inside their own provision gardens. So we can see things being added to the soils there that might increase the levels of phosphorus or nitrogen in the soil. When we do excavations of house yards like this, we actually take samples of the soil from regular patterns across the site, and we subject those samples to laboratory analysis to tell us what the chemical composition of that soil is. And we can actually mark out concentrations in those elements that are associated with fertilizing garden plots. And that's a great way, again, that we can begin to document how is this exterior space being used in addition to the interior space that might seem most apparent when we look at a cabin environment. So we're actually inside the cabin now. We've spent a lot of time talking about the exterior space. This provides us an opportunity to look at a reconstructed interior space. Among the items inside the cabin are certain things that we might find archaeologically, and I'll point those out in just a second. But one of the primary things that we actually find archaeologically, if we're lucky, associated with such cabins, is this small, we call it a subfloor pit, this small root cellar that's dug oftentimes close to the hearth. Just like we talk about sort of root cellars today, the uses of these pits actually probably changed over time. They certainly may have been used to store food goods as a way to sort of keep them warm over the winter period through the heat of the hearth. But oftentimes it also looks like these are the sort of the closets of their era. And certainly when cabins like this were destroyed, holes like this were where trash and items that had been left and forgotten oftentimes were swept in and filled up. So these root cellars are actually some of the few archaeological features that we might find on sites like this with such impermanent architecture. Now, looking around the interior of this space here, we can also see objects that are representative of things that may have been owned by individuals who were enslaved on one of these outlying farms. We can see a range of ceramics and other sorts of bowls, material that would have been used for cooking and eating. And we can actually tie specific patterns. So this plate in the center, we can see sort of the molded edge around it with the blue coloration. We can actually identify specific types of ceramics that are being produced in England, shipped over here to America, and bought and sold by planters like Washington, and also in stores in places like Alexandria or other small towns. Enslaved individuals did have access to cash, perhaps by growing extra food in their garden, by raising small animals like poultry or bees, or doing fishing or hunting in hours that were not occupied in laboring for Washington. It's a complex story, and we don't want to sort of mitigate the reality, the harshness of enslavement. But an equally important story that I think we need to tell in this relation of enslaved individuals having access to cash is it's a really important way in which they could express their own identity. And this institution that was structured around dehumanization, having access to cash, being able to go to a store and purchase your own plates, your own buttons that you might put onto an outfit, to clothing that was issued to you by Washington. We need to recognize that as being a truly important act of resistance in some ways to dehumanization that was brought about by the institution of enslavement. By expressing choice, these folks were able to challenge their own sort of dehumanization. It's also important to recognize that foundation of Black entrepreneurship has its roots very early in American history, and sort of the ability to supply food to these urban centers like Alexandria through these Sunday markets actually was a really important part of the development of some of these urban locations. And it was also important to the local economies here, where cash was being exchanged by these enslaved individuals and others throughout the region. So again, this sort of very key central point, which I don't think we always recognize, about the power of Black entrepreneurship, even in this moment of enslavement, both as an act of resistance and as a way to sort of build our nation from its very inception.
Click the subscribe button below and the bell icon to get notifications for new videos about George Washington and behind-the-scenes work at Mount Vernon.